see you all this morning, and welcome to our witnesses. All the witnesses are online for this first panel. To the witnesses, if you are not speaking, if you could keep your mics on mute. We have with us this morning...
Chair, just a point of order.
Yes. We have a point of order from Mr. Mazer. One moment, please.
Just wondering, there's been multiple requests from the parties getting Mark Carney here to be a witness at this study. So have you heard back from Mr. Carney at all?
I haven't personally, but maybe our team here has. Have we heard back from Mr. Carney?
He's available in October.
He's available in October, apparently.
He plans on coming?
Well, I believe so. Well, we're going to have a steering committee at 3:30. We can discuss all of these potential witnesses.
Mr. Chair,
yes.
Apologies, but that's not a point of order. That's for in-committee work. I think that's...
Yes, that's why I said we'll discuss in steering.
In camera.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vancouver. Okay, so we have with us Peter Deutsch, professor at the University of Victoria. We have, who's appearing testifying as an individual. We have from the Canadian Climate Institute, Jonathan Arnold, acting director, Clean Growth. And from the Carbon Tracker Initiative, we have Mr. Michael Coffin, head of oil, gas, and mining. We'll start with Professor Deutsch for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you for inviting me as a witness to your committee. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Lekwang peoples from whose territories I'm zooming in today. Je donnerai ma présentation.
I'll be making my presentation in English, but would be happy to respond to any questions in French.
In a nutshell, here's what I'm going to show in the next 5 minutes. I will argue that our current financial infrastructure throws a wrench in the green transition. I'll proceed in 4 main steps. I will look at the main policy approach today, explain where that approach goes wrong and why, and I will look at the situation here in Canada in particular, and finally I will finish with a concrete policy recommendation.
I think we're having trouble with interpretation.
Okay, je pense que...
It's good now. Everything's good.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, continue, please.
Okay, I'll continue. So you've just heard the four steps. Step number 1, main policy approach today. So there's many different ideas out there about how to facilitate the green transition, but here's something that policymakers globally seem to agree on today. They agree that relying on government spending alone will not be enough for a successful green transition, that private investment will be needed too. This is why different policy frameworks try to incentivize private investment in green energy. Think of the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, or here in Canada, the Clean Fuels Fund. Now, what all these initiatives are betting on is that investing in green energy will be sufficient to bring emissions down and meet our climate goals. This, I will argue, is a mistake because it's based on a misunderstanding of how our financial system actually works. So to see why that's the case, consider 2 features of contemporary economies. The first feature is money creation. Many people think of commercial banks as intermediaries. Robin needs to put in some money before Chris can take out a loan. Now, it's true that banks are intermediaries, but they're not just intermediaries. Their banking license enables them to create money out of thin air, and they will do so if they think the borrower will pay the money back. There's some regulatory constraints on this, but they're not very restrictive. So what this means is that if a bank thinks that a fossil fuel project will be profitable, it will provide a loan. The other important thing to realize here is that no licensed bank in economies such as Canada can extend any loans without the support of the central bank, in our case, the Bank of Canada. This support takes many forms, including clearing the money the commercial bank has lent through the national payment system. So in other words, it would be misleading to call money created by commercial banks private finance. Instead, this is public money creation outsourced to private institutions. So let's move on to the second feature of contemporary economies, negative externalities from greenhouse gas emissions. We know that market prices don't incorporate the social and environmental costs of climate change, which are huge. Various forms of carbon pricing, including carbon taxes, try to correct for this inefficiency and raise the price of carbon-intensive activities to a sustainable level. However, economic models tell us that today's carbon prices are nowhere near where they would need to be. Notice what this means. Many fossil fuel projects that are unsustainable and inefficient will still be profitable. Now step back and ask yourself what happens when these 2 features of contemporary economies I've just described occur at the same time. In short, commercial banks will keep lending to the fossil fuel sector. They can keep lending to the fossil fuel sector because there's no firm limit on their lending. And they will keep lending because they deem that sector to be profitable. And as long as carbon prices remain inefficiently low due to political choices, this will indeed be the case. So in other words, all the green investment our current policies are encouraging will not stop commercial banks from lending to fossil fuel projects. They'll simply do both. So we end up with more cheaper energy, but we won't bring emissions down. If you saw the early estimate for 2023 emissions published by the Canadian Climate Institute last week, we're at 702 megatons. That's only slightly down from the year before, and the subcategory of emissions from oil and gas is actually up. So this brings me to my third point, the situation here in Canada. Since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, the world's 60 largest banks have provided $6.9 trillion in financing to fossil fuel projects, with US dollars 705 billion coming in 2023 alone. 5 Canadian banks are among the top 21 banks lending to fossil fuels worldwide and have provided a total of 911 billion US dollars to the sector since 2015. What I want to re-emphasize here is that this is not private lending. This is lending that happens under the auspices of central banks, including the Bank of Canada, and this lending is therefore a political choice. So if you talk to representatives of the Bank of Canada, they're likely to contest part of what I've said. They will say that climate considerations are not part of their mandate, and this is true. However, notice that this is entirely compatible with their policies having significant side effects on climate and on climate policy. Finally, point 4, policy recommendations. So in light of this analysis, what could be done? How could we stop our financial architecture from putting a wrench in the green transition and instead mobilize it for effective climate mitigation? What we've seen is that it's not enough to turn the financial...
Professor, I've allocated it a little extra time because of the interruption around interpretation, but if you could wrap it up in about 10 seconds, there'll be time in the question and answer period for you to raise a lot of these points.
So what we need is a credit policy. We need to attach conditions to the capacity of commercial banks to create money through credit. Et je vais juste résumer ce que j'ai dit en français. J'ai argumenté que la politique...
Quickly, the current policy to mitigate climate change, it has some gaps. Encouraging investments in green energy we need a credit system.
Monsieur Arnold, de l'Institut.
Mr. Arnold, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you for the opportunity to meet with the committee this morning. My remarks today focus on 4 policy insights from the Canadian Climate Institute's research and our work with the Sustainable Finance Action Council on developing a green and transition taxonomy in Canada. The first insight is that climate change and the global response to it is quickly transforming the fundamentals of economic competitiveness. The costs of climate change are increasing rapidly and are already costing Canadian households billions of dollars. These costs will continue to rise as extreme weather events become more frequent and will be a drag on the financial system and economic growth. At the same time, the combination of markets, technology, and policy are accelerating the energy transition faster than what most experts thought possible even just a few years ago. Renewables such as wind and solar are being deployed faster and cheaper than any other source of electricity in history. Over 70 countries have now committed to net zero by mid-century, which covers over 90% of global GDP, 80% of global oil demand, and 75% of global natural gas demand. All of these trends are reshaping what competitiveness means in the global economy. The second insight is that the architecture of the global financial system is aligning with this new economic future with standards for climate-related disclosure, taxonomies, and transition plans. On climate-related disclosures, countries representing more than half of global GDP have either adopted or are in the process of adopting the ISSB's standards. This includes the European Union, United Kingdom, Japan, Australia, and Brazil. On sustainable taxonomies, 30 countries either have adopted or are developing their own taxonomies. This list includes most of the G7 and G20 countries, plus many developing economies. Efforts to standardize corporate transition plans for businesses and financial institutions are also well underway. The UK Transition Plan Task Force has set a gold standard for what credible transition plans look like, and the IFRS, the body responsible for setting global accounting standards, is now adopting this work in full. These developments are standardizing and improving information in capital markets, ensuring that transition and physical risks from climate change get priced into how capital gets allocated. This helps reduce greenwashing and drives investments that are genuinely aligned with global climate goals, both of which help reduce systemic risk in Canada's financial system. The third insight is that falling behind on these emerging global standards will compromise Canada's ability to attract capital. Transitioning Canada's economy to compete in the global energy transition requires an additional $80 to $115 billion annually. Most of this capital will need to come from the private sector and from foreign investors in particular, given the relatively small size of Canada's economy. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act is amplifying the competition for attracting these investment dollars. These facts stress why it's imperative that Canada keep up with global standards in climate-related disclosure, transition plans, and taxonomy. On one hand, investors and lenders looking for opportunities within Canada will expect the same level of high quality and consistent rules set internationally. Without complete and comparable data, investors and lenders will underinvest due to this higher risk. On the other, Canadian multinationals are increasingly exposed to more stringent reporting and disclosure standards in other jurisdictions. A 2024 report by the Institute for Sustainable Finance found that over 1,300 Canadian-based companies will be subject to the EU's new sustainability reporting standards. The fourth and final insight is that strengthening Canada's financial architecture, coupled with strong climate policy, can improve the country's long-term competitiveness. So far, Canada has been slow to adopt global standards in all three areas and should accelerate these efforts. On disclosure, the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board is in the process of adopting globally aligned disclosure standards, but is facing pressure to weaken them. Canada has also been slow to develop a green and transition taxonomy. The Sustainable Finance Action Council's 2023 roadmap report was supported by the country's 25 largest financial institutions. However, efforts to establish a national standardized taxonomy have yet to get underway. Overall, maintaining and growing Canada's market share in the energy transition will hinge on its ability to attract capital. Matching or surpassing international standards will help the country get there. In fact, Canada is well positioned to take a global leadership role in these areas. The SFAC taxonomy roadmap provided the first sophisticated framework for labeling transition investments, designed to help Canada transition its existing emissions-intensive engines of growth. Done well, and Canada could play an outsized role in promoting the adoption of this framework in other emissions-intensive economies. Having one of the ISSB offices located in Montreal also gives Canada a unique leadership platform and responsibility. In addition to accelerating these foundational pieces of financial architecture, other key policies are important complements to improving Canada's long-term competitiveness. Among these, Canada's industrial carbon pricing system is driving the bulk of emissions reductions in the Canadian economy, while also protecting the competitiveness of individual sectors and helping to attract low-carbon investment. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss these important issues, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll go straight to questions. We'll start with Mr. Cram for 6 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Professor Deitch from the University of Victoria, I read with interest your book entitled, or that you co-authored, entitled, "Do Central Banks Serve the People?" I suppose now might be a good time for a spoiler alert for anyone watching at home, but Professor, do central banks serve the people?
Yes, they do, but we can always do better. So this is a very good question to reframe what I said earlier. So central banks' main mandate today in most countries is a narrow mandate of price stability, and for a long time, I would say for most of the post-war period, that was a good mandate because what central banks did to promote price stability did not have too many unintended side effects on other policy objectives. Now, with the financial crisis and with the COVID crisis and with the new instruments that central banks have been employing, there have been more unintended side effects of these policies on other policy fields, including on wealth inequality and on the climate. And so that's why we're in a position where I think we have to rethink how the interaction between what central banks do and what other parts of government do interacts. So what I've tried to show earlier is that something that happens under the supervision of the Bank of Canada, namely bank lending, actually throws a wrench in the green transition. And I think that's something that we need to A, realize, and 2, act upon.
Professor, in your book, you talk about a lack of transparency at central banks and the lack of response to criticism that central banks take. Can you elaborate on these points a little bit?
So I mean, it's tricky because what central banks they do today is watched by by financial markets, and every word is put on the scale, and so the official communication of central banks is relatively restricted. They have become more transparent, but one of the aspects that we criticize in the book is that there is no open political debate about the substantive issues about what central banks do and what the unintended side effects are. So if you look again at the concrete point that I made earlier, the fact that the Bank of Canada in our case implicitly accepts all the lending by commercial banks in Canada is not something that is widely discussed as a political issue.
Bank of Canada were to adopt this taxonomy system, and after some time there are problems with the system that need to be corrected. How do we avoid some of the problems that you identified in your book with the lack of response to criticisms and the lack of willingness of central banks to correct their past mistakes?
I think there's good models in the past and in the present for how to do these things. So, for instance, in Asian countries, there's much more coordination between governments and central banks. In the past, in countries such as Canada or in European countries, there was much more coordination between what the government does and what the central bank does. So today we've got a very strong independence framework, and there are justifications for that. So we have to be careful in tinkering with the system that we have, but at the same time, the unintended side effects, in this case on the climate, are becoming too important to ignore them.
In this
Sorry,
parliament...
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is my microphone on now? Okay,
yes.
Very good. So there has been an idea debated in this parliament that central banks and the Bank of Canada should be subject to audits by the Auditor General's office. In your opinion, Professor, would this offer a greater degree of transparency for the Bank of Canada if it moves forward with this taxonomy system?
Look, the devil's in the detail. There are many ways to implement this coordination that I talked about. I'm not going to endorse one over the other at this point. What I'm arguing is that we need this coordination so that the right hand of the government doesn't undermine what the left hand does. Right now, we've got a commitment to climate goals, and what I've tried to show is that central bank action, or what happens under the supervision of central bank action, actually throws a wrench in the green transition. So that's what needs to be addressed. There's many ways to do it.
Okay, thank you. Chair, how am I doing for time? A minute left. Okay, so maybe I'll switch gears to Mr. Arnold from the Canadian Climate Institute. Mr. Arnold, what would happen to the rates of return of pension funds and mutual funds if chartered banks focused less on rates of return and more on complying with the taxonomy system provided by the Bank of Canada?
You have 30 seconds for a response.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Some of the research that we've done in this area suggests that financial institutions may be investing in green and transition assets at a lower level than what they would otherwise because of the lack of standardized information. So this is actually not about changing or modifying the mandate of financial institutions like pension plans, who are still going to have a fiduciary duty to the customers that they represent.
We'll have to stop there, yeah. Okay, Mr. Van Koeverden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us. We're always so grateful for expertise and for people who do this research for a living to come to our committee and provide us with your wisdom and insight. My first question will be for Professor Dietsch. Professor Dietsch, earlier this year, our government brought forth Bill C-59, which contains a Truth in Advertising amendment that requires corporations to provide evidence to support their environmental claims. Now, subsequent to that, the Pathways Alliance, a group of oil sands companies, removed all of their website and social media content from the internet. Now, the Competition Bureau defines greenwashing as false or misleading environmental ads or environmental claims that seem vague, exaggerated, or not accompanied by supporting statements. Now, it's fairly clear that we've seen that type of behavior or conduct from the oil and gas sector in Canada, but in your view, are there financial institutions in Canada that are also greenwashing when they use broad terms like sustainable finance without backing them up with data?
I think I would agree that there is more.
Point of order.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Just did we miss one of the witnesses?
Yes, we did, and I was
I
going to
just-
bring that up after Mr. Vancouver, and I apologize, Mr.
I just think
Coffin.
that maybe to give all of the MPs the opportunity to ask questions to all of the witnesses, if we
fair.
allow him to have his 5 minutes before
Yeah, it should
Mr.
be-
Vancouver.
Okay,
then-
so I apologize, Mr. Coffin. I'm really sorry. Yeah, so go ahead for your 5 minutes, and we'll pick up after. Sorry about that. I really am. It's tough when sometimes you don't see somebody in front of you. Anyway, I apologize.
Good morning, everybody.
No, you don't. Okay, go ahead, please, Mr. Coffin.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. So climate change is absolutely the defining challenge of this century and will give rise to increasingly severe financial risks unless we accelerate climate action. Risks include not only the costs of adapting to physical impacts, for example, increased fire and hurricane intensity, but also those related to transitioning businesses as policymakers act to attempt to avert the worst physical aspects. Transition risks include both policy and regulatory-related transition risks, predominantly focused on decarbonising activities, and technology-related transition risks related to changing demand patterns and consumer preferences. Individual sectors are impacted differently by these climate-related financial risks. They are, however, all interrelated. Policy action to reduce the physical impacts on sectors such as agriculture drives policy action to decarbonise others, such as transport, for example, mandates to shift to electric vehicles. In turn, this reduces demand for oil products for transport fuels via substitution. Coal and gas are similarly impacted as electricity is increasingly generated from renewables. Climate risks are felt by businesses across all sectors, and by extension, their investors. This is particularly so for investors with long-term liabilities invested across a broad cross-section of the market, universal owners, including defined benefit pension schemes. Given many such schemes, including 4 of the 5 largest funds, Canadian funds by assets under management state-backed, climate risk is ultimately held by governments and taxpayers. Climate change must be viewed as a systemic financial risk to markets, and politicians who dismiss climate risk as a woke concern do so at their own peril. From a Canadian economic perspective, agriculture is a big sector, highly exposed to physical impacts, while also a major fossil extractor and exporting economy. As European banks increasingly turn away from fossil fuel lending, these risks are becoming concentrated within the Canadian financial system. Lower long-term demand for oil and gas exports will also impact the system. Investors must consider the impacts of these climate-related financial risks on portfolios and use appropriate climate models and scenario analyses to do so. Pension funds should keep the methods they use to assess risks current and keep members informed on how they are managed. Current practices in the investment industry have major shortcomings, however. A range of key players, from investment consultants to pension funds and banks, rely on economists' flawed research to map warming to future GDP damages, informing investment decisions as well as supervisory stress tests. Such economist work is generally self-referential, generally ignoring critical feedback from climate science. Invalid assumptions within such model, the DICE integrated assessment model from William Nordhaus, include industries not exposed to weather will be unaffected by global warming, which also ignores the 2 types of transition risk I described earlier. And 2, a quadratic function is appropriate to extrapolate damages, despite other functions, for example, an exponential function, equally fitting our historic data, but projecting far greater climate impacts. Such damages are likely greater for a given temperature and occur sooner in time. They will likely have a greater cost in present value terms, i.e. the financial costs are less discounted, and so the benefit of climate action is underestimated within the financial system. Carbon Tracker's report, Loading the Dice, warned following the advice of investment consultants, pension funds have informed members that global warming of 2 to 4.5 degrees Celsius will have only a minimal impact on portfolios. Another study looking at economist projections suggested a 5-degree C world would lower GDP by 10% and a 7-degree C world just 20%, which cannot conceivably be reconciled with climate scientists' warnings that such temperature rises would be an existential threat to human civilization. Ultimately, financial institutions, central banks, regulators, and governments have all been misled by such models and underestimating the dangers and likely economic damages of climate change. While that report was focused on UK pensions, it featured in the Canadian press, and findings were applied to a number of Canadian pension funds, including from AIMCO, PMP, IMCO, and others, where a lack of disclosure leaves plan members ultimately in the dark about the pension risks of climate change. Furthermore, a review of 2023 Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure reports of leading pension funds found many others were lacking in terms of their climate disclosures, particularly around choice of scenarios and climate risks being presented. We see a number of areas for potential regulatory interventions focusing on investors, investment consultants, the economics community, requirements for corporates, for example, consideration of publishing of transition plans, as for example in the UK's Transition Plan Task Force, and the FRAG guidance in the European Union.
Thank you. We're going to have to stop there. We're going to have to stop there, Mr. Coffin. We'll pick up from Mr. Vancouverden. Again, my apologies for missing you before.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of our witnesses, including Mr. Coffin, for coming today to share your insight. Professor Dietsch, do you need me to repeat any part of the question that I asked earlier?
No, that's fine, and I've had some time to think about it now. So the question is greenwashing more widely spread than the fossil fuel sector? So I'd say two things. I would say that there is greenwashing going on in the financial sector too, but there's an explanation for this. As Mark Carney, who you, I think, rightly want to invite you to your committee, keeps repeating, financial institutions are very bad at evaluating climate risk. Right? So they might actually believe that something is sustainable when it isn't. So that leads me to the second point. What we need is a paradigm shift about what's going on. Right? So blaming commercial banks alone would be short-sighted. It's the Bank of Canada that supervises what they do. They lend to fossil fuels. Who gives the Bank of Canada the mandate? The government does. Who elects the government? We do. So in a way, we're all in this together, and we have to realize that these are political choices that we're making. What's happening in the financial sector, in a way, is a huge implicit subsidy to the fossil fuel sector that is not discussed as such. So that's what we need to focus on.
Thank you. And I couldn't agree more with the notion that we're all in this together. Climate change doesn't care what color your lawn signs are. It affects us all. And I won't say equally, because it certainly does affect already more vulnerable people more than it does with others. This question I'm going to ask to all three, so I'll ask the question first and then run through, perhaps with Professor Dietsch going first. Most people agree with the notion that runaway carbon emissions are largely responsible for climate change and extreme weather, and understand that oil and gas producing nations like Canada need to reduce our emissions. All industries in Canada have demonstrated some progress, except Canada's oil and gas sector. Higher emissions are being driven primarily by oil sands and bitumen production in Alberta. And despite that, Conservatives seem to be of the opinion that Canadian emissions are somehow exceptional, more ethical, or less damaging to our environment. My question is whether or not that is compatible with the science, and if you believe that pricing pollution is one way to reduce our emissions. Professor Dietsch, I'd start with you.
So the simple part of the question first, I think, yes, that's what the science shows, is that the carbon emissions are causing harms from health outcomes to premature deaths in Canada, et cetera, climate events. And the economics shows that this is already more costly than profitable. It's just the question of who bears the costs, right? So I agree with you that a first best solution would be to internalize those externalities and have higher prices on carbon emitting activities. But I think we also need to work on the financial system, and that's why I try to outline what's going on there in terms of the bank lending. Thanks.
Mr. Arnold?
Yes, thanks for the question. To start with the last part of that first, yes, carbon pricing is fundamental, and the research of the Institute has shown that the industrial carbon pricing system in Canada has driven the bulk of emissions reductions in the country, and that would include emissions reductions from industrial sectors, such as oil and gas, although, as you mentioned, emissions continue to go up. Carbon pricing plays a role there, certainly, but there are other complementary policies as well that we've looked at, including more stringent methane regulations, a cap on oil and gas emissions, as well as other market-based policies. And this, I think, gets back to the idea of a taxonomy. We've laid out a framework for how investments in oil and gas might meet the label of transition under very stringent requirements. We put out a paper on that last year, but essentially it would require commitments at a corporate level to net zero with clear, credible transition plans, as well as at the asset level, having an emissions curve that aligns with net zero. So it's a high bar, but not impossible. And that's the type of policy that we see as necessary to bend the curve.
There's been a lot. If you'd like me to repeat the question, I'm happy to.
So I think I heard I missed the audio cut out in the first part. I'm happy with the question. Yeah.
Okay, great. All I was asking was the preface of the question was about how most industries in Canada have demonstrated progress in lowering their emissions. I gather from your intervention that you agree that carbon emissions are driving climate change and extreme weather. And my question directly was whether or not Canadian emissions from Canadian industry are somehow exceptional or more ethical or less damaging, thereby leading to the very common conservative notion that we ought to drive industry, oil and gas in Canada because our emissions are somehow better than other countries. Does the science back that up?
30 seconds, please.
Well, I mean, I'd support the comments of the other two witnesses. What I would say is, so no, Canadian emissions are in no way exceptional in that regard. And I think I'd make another point. Ultimately, the energy transition is about moving away from oil and gas. So in some ways, decarbonising it doesn't really make sense. It's about reducing the volume of production and the consumption over time. And so you need to decarbonise consumption sectors, but actually for the energy supply sector, you need to move away from oil and gas.
Thank you, Madame Posey.
Oui, merci.
Thank you to our witnesses.
Des témoins, j'aimerais ça qu'ils puissent nous les envoyer parce que c'était super intéressant. Donc, je commencerai avec vous, M. Arnold de l'Institut climatique du Canada. Vous savez, on parle souvent de croissance propre. Ça m'énerve de voir ces deux mots-là ensemble. Puis vous venez de l'aborder justement, mais M. Coffin vient de l'aborder en disant qu'il faut d'abord réduire. La croissance d'une économie, ben, ça passe, décarbonée, ben, ça passe par la priorisation des sources d'énergie carboneutres.
Point of order?
S'il vous plaît, il n'y a pas de... Il n'y a pas d'interprétation, si j'ai bien compris.
This is the interpreter speaking.
Okay, who was on? I don't know who was.
English translation was on the French channel.
Are we back to normal? Allez-y.
Alors on revient.
So let's start again. Yes. So what I was saying is this. Often we talk about clean growth, and, you know, Mr. Coffin just referred to this. First of all, we have to reduce. First of all, we need to prioritize carbon neutral energy sources and things that are less damaging for health. When the financial system does not adjust because there are no regulations, then actually society as a whole becomes the creditor for the damage caused by climate change. We know what happened in the summer, in August in Montreal. Mr. Arnold, your organization has a great deal of credibility and, in fact, has the ear of the federal government. Will you be supporting unambiguously the bill that is supporting climate finance efforts? I think you're aware of this bill that is before the Senate. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you for the question. I think there are many elements of that legislation that align with the research that we've done related to taxonomy and disclosure, and I think broadly there's a lot more effort that needs to be done in that regard. To your earlier point, I mean, we released a report 2 years ago now called Sink or Swim, and it really tried to divide up the types of activities and the types of change that we need to see in the economy. So we stress tested the Canadian economy based on different global low carbon scenarios. And from that, we were able to see different impacts in what we call demand decline sectors. So that being fossil fuels. There, what really needs to happen is that those sectors, those businesses need to transform into new business lines that align with net zero. There's a second bucket of sectors, what we call carbon cost sectors. These are the sectors that are emissions intensive and need to reduce their emissions and will have demand through the transition.
Je vous arrête là-dessus, Monsieur Arnold. Donc, ce que j'en...
Okay, so from what I gather, based on my first question and your answer, is that Bill S-243, that you supported, and that you, in fact, it could go even further from what I gather. So there is an effort to focus on taxonomy within that bill. Mr. Coffin, it's music to my ears when you talk about the importance of reduction. We heard from the 5 CEOs of the major banks, and they were telling us about how they contribute to the fight against climate change. So they appeared, but now you raised pension funds as well as insurance and other sectors in finance. So can you tell us in which way their actions affect climate change? That's my first question. And second, what would it mean if there were a regulatory framework that were really genuine, that were predictable for these insurances, the pension funds, and other sectors in finance?
So there's an awful lot in there. I think for me, there's a real need to, from the taxonomy question, thinking about things that are genuinely transition and sustainable activities or transition finance. And I think it's really important that oil and gas companies ultimately don't receive transition finance, because they don't have to become anything. It's critical they move away from what they currently do, but they don't have to become anything. And I think there's a real risk that companies get financing through transition or green bonds to do potentially green things, but actually it helps continue their financing what they're doing. So driving that stronger regulation is really, really important. And that's particularly the case with things like carbon capture and storage, things like natural gas and LNG. So if you have regulations that, and the financial system and the pension funds being in some ways hoodwinked by the industry that carbon capture and storage is a solution and it's a climate positive piece, actually, that is one example of how the investment sector must really challenge and the investment community must really challenge what they're being told by industry and critically challenge that, and not fall for ultimately these false solutions by the industry that are perpetuate business as usual. And crucially, government frameworks and regulation, and I've seen this through my work on a number of frameworks.
I think Madame Posé wants to ask another question.
Yes, sorry, I was no longer hearing the interpretation for the last couple of sentences, perhaps because my mic was on. I'm not sure.
Your last couple of sentences, Mr. Collins? Coffin, sorry.
Écoutez, je vais y aller avec une autre question.
Look, I'll go ahead with another question, perhaps in the same vein. You gave us a few examples. Could you give us some examples of jurisdictions and not just businesses where robust regulations in the banking sector have had positive results?
Draw examples of the UK, where I'm based, and you have the Transition Plan Task Force, where it's looking at transition plans, and that's for corporates of many natures. You have the corporates involved in the real economy, but you have the financial institutions as corporates themselves. So that has a clear guidance for banks and other financial institutions about how they should act to decarbonise their portfolios, including Scope 3 financed and facilitated emissions, responding to climate-related risks and opportunities, and then contributing to economy-wide transition. And you see that reflected in the banks. And thinking more broadly in Europe, you see an example would be BNP Paribas and how they have reduced and sort of very rapidly declining their financing for fossil fuels. And there are a number of other examples in Europe. I think there are other regulatory things, and I'd draw an example of the Advertising Standards Agency in the United Kingdom.
Well, we'll have to stop there and go to Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll start with Professor Deitch. First of all, thanks so much to all the witnesses. Now, if I understand your argument correctly, the green transition is unlikely to succeed in the way that we're currently approaching it. And really, fossil fuel investment has and will continue to remain strong. We've heard from previous witnesses during the study that 1 in 5 bank directors have an explicit connection to a fossil fuel company. We know there's a lot of overlap between the interests of the big banks and the interests of the large oil and gas companies in Canada. Can you talk a little bit about how your suggestion, this credit policy, might impact that?
Thank you. Well, I think the bottom line of my intervention is to say that it's not enough, and this is what current policies both in Canada and elsewhere are focused on. It's not enough to turn the tap on for green finance investment, because we have a financial system that is malleable, that is flexible. So when we do that, we just get more and cheaper energy. What we need to do is we need to actively turn the tap off for fossil fuel financing. And whatever the landscape of interests, the cross holdings between companies, say between the financial sector and the oil and gas sector, whatever they might be, I think effective regulation would prevent some of this investment from happening. So this allows me maybe to say something that I was going to say at the end, namely what a credit policy could look like. So for instance, you could charge banks that have a higher exposure to fossil fuels, you could charge them higher interest rates as the central bank, or you could require higher capital requirements. Or at the extreme, you could even tell them, look, we're not going to, if you get into financial trouble due to your fossil fuel holdings, we're not going to bail you out. All of these are measures that would effectively incentivize those banks to reduce their lending to the sector.
Thank you. My next question is to Mr. Arnold. You outlined the devastating costs of the climate crisis and how that's already having an impact on Canadian households, costing them billions, and that this is going to increasingly be a drag on our economy. Can you talk a little bit more about those two pieces, the disclosures, and what steps Canada, where we are now, and what steps we need to take in order to be in line with our global peers? But then also, maybe I'll follow up with a question about the taxonomy.
Yeah, thank you. So I think broadly, this just comes down to a big question of information, and information not being standardized in a way that participants in capital markets can really use it, and in a way that you would see those risks starting to get priced into decision making. So right now, we do not have a good full grasp of the physical risks of climate change, or the physical costs of climate change, and as a result, those are not getting priced into decisions. So we still see housing developments, for example, being developed in areas that are extreme risk of flooding or sea level rise or wildfire. And so our adaptation team at the Institute is doing work in this area to study that in more detail. Same goes for transition risks. We don't have a standardized definition of what is quote unquote green or transition. And as a result, there are lots of different interpretations, and that creates ambiguity. And that lack of standardized, credible information, it causes many investors to underinvest in the energy transition and to overinvest into things like oil and gas that carry a higher transition risk.
And on the taxonomy piece, we've heard concerning rumors about the government's potential intention to include LNG, a fossil fuel, in the kind of sustainable finance taxonomy, and labeling that a fossil fuel as sustainable finance. Can you tell us your thoughts or reflect on that?
Yes, and this is a concern that we take very seriously in the work that we do and have done at the Institute. And as I referenced earlier, we published a paper earlier this year looking at what types of requirements might need to be true in order for an oil and gas asset to meet that transition label. And it is an extremely high bar. As I said, it would require commitments at the corporate level to have net zero targets that include Scope 3 emissions, which none currently do. And at the asset level, it would require significant investments in new technologies to drive down emissions to get on a net zero pathway. So we see that it is possible, but the framework that we've laid out would make that an extremely high bar, and there would need to be significant change within the industry and at the corporate level and at the asset level for that to happen.
You have about 15 seconds for a comment.
Maybe just asking the other two witnesses kind of a yes or no. Just a yes or no around including
yes or no.
LNG as a sustainable finance within a taxonomy.
Yeah, yes or no.
be a clear no from me.
Okay, that's good and succinct.
No from me.
Okay. For that. Okay, we'll go now to the second round, but I'm going to reduce each person's time by 40% so that we can finish this panel on time. Monsieur Deltel, vous avez 3 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here and for taking part in our consultations today. You're welcome within the Canadian Parliament. Of course, Mr. Chair, climate change is real. We have to adapt. And as Mr. Poilievre has said in his speech in Quebec, or said it in Quebec a year ago, there need to be tax incentives to reduce emissions through new technology. We have to move more quickly towards a green transition. We have all of the resources we need to fully develop to their full potential. And if we do so, we will be well served. And then we also have to work hand in hand with First Nations to develop this potential certainly in Indigenous lands. Those concepts, those ideas have been repeated by Mr. Poilievre, and again, he was discussing this last year. My first question is for Mr. Arnold. Mr. Arnold, you said earlier, in fact, I was quite pleased to see that you were referring to solar and wind. If we make a great deal of effort to speed up the green effort in wind, hydro, geothermal, nuclear even, would Canada come out ahead if we were focusing on these green energies? We have to speed these things up, don't we?
Absolutely, yes, but speeding that up requires stringent policy in multiple different ways. So I referenced the industrial carbon pricing system. The consumer carbon tax also plays a role. Clean fuel standards will play a role. All of the other policy initiatives that I mentioned in my opening statement around disclosure, taxonomy, and transition plans will all play a role. This will not happen without a significant lift from policy and ramping up the different types of policy we have today, and then also introducing new policies to keep bending the emissions curve down.
Professeur Dietsch, vous avez dit tout à l'heure qu'il faut...
Professor Dietsch, you were saying investments need to be made. Last year, the federal government decided to announce close to $18 billion in direct grants. $18 billion for one single project. Could we have used these funds for another purpose?
Alors, j'ai pas vraiment dit qu'il faut faire des...
I wasn't saying we needed to invest. I was saying we need to pull away from the fossil fuels sector's investment. There are a number of ways of doing that. I have 15 seconds, so I'll stop there. That's a good answer.
Alors, on passe maintenant... Pardon? Pardon? Ben, c'est 15 secondes.
Sorry, that's 15 seconds. 15 seconds is all you had. You can't do any more.
J'ai pas compris, mais...
Sorry, I didn't hear you, but that's okay.
It's your turn now for 3 minutes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, did you call me?
Yeah, Ms. Taylor, I have you on the list as the next questioner.
Yes,
Yeah,
I am.
for 3
Thank you. I
minutes,
just didn't hear it cut out on the audio. Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses. I could ask you so many questions and sit and listen to you all day, but I have a few pointed ones. We just heard from Mr. Deltel that the issue is about increasing investments in technology, and the Conservative Party likes to say that this is the problem, is that we're not investing sufficient in technology and that this will solve our problems. I'm just wondering if you could comment on this and whether you think that investing in technology will be sufficient to help us meet our net zero, or in fact, on its own, meet our net zero targets. Perhaps we can start with Mr. Arnold.
Yes, technology will certainly play a role, but policy is a huge foundational piece to driving the incentives toward more innovation and research and deployment, frankly, in those technologies. Canada has a swath of extremely innovative small clean tech companies, but we have a very hard time commercializing because we are a small market. So there are very well-targeted policies to help those small technology companies deploy and commercialize things like the Canada Growth Fund, for example, to really help keep businesses in Canada. If you look at the most successful technologies out there in terms of climate change.
Sorry, Mr. Arnold, I don't have much time,
Yep,
but so I just
sure.
wanted to ask one follow-up question on that. Do you think that without a carbon pricing or price on pollution, that these investments are going to be attractive to investors in this technology? Or do you think that internalizing rather the externalities is necessary in order to get the sufficient investment in actually transitioning to a green economy?
Yeah, internalizing the externality of greenhouse gas emissions is fundamental to solving the problem. And there are also a range of other complementary policies that we've talked about, but carbon pricing is and should be the foundation of a credible, strong approach on climate policy.
Thank you very much. And I had another question. When the 5 major bank CEOs were at committee recently, I asked each of them directly. They talked about their transition plans, about how they were invested in the reaching net zero targets. And I asked them if any of them were willing to commit to only financing oil and gas company projects that either reduced or were neutral in terms of adding to greenhouse gases. None of them were willing to commit. And I'm wondering if you can comment on whether you think it's possible to reach our net zero goals if oil and gas companies continue to increase production and Canadian banks continue to finance this increase in production.
You have about 15 seconds, so if you could be succinct, that would be great.
I mean, just by arithmetic, no, that is not possible. Oil and gas emissions represent about 25% of Canada's total emissions, and that's just the upstream scope 1 and 2 emissions. So, no.
Okay, merci.
Okay.
Madame Posé.
Thank you.
1 minute.
You have a minute and a half. Okay. Thank you. So quickly, Professor Deutsch, you were saying there needed to be a credit system and a policy. The major banks are part of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and at the same time, they invest in the oil and gas sector. We call that greenwashing. I know, I'm not sure for you, but it might not be the best way to turn off the tap for fossil fuels when we know that CEOs in the banking sector are also on the boards of these oil and gas companies. Are you optimistic about a change here in Canada?
Alors, première chose à dire, c'est que
First, I'm skeptical about any voluntary agreements and alliances that expect corporate responsibility to enter into place. And we need regulations. Without regulations, these companies will be still focusing on profits. They're not going to leave profits on the table. So it really has to do with regulating the financial sector. That's what we need to focus on. And then I can be more optimistic. In the constant regulatory framework, I'm pessimistic. And what do you think of the current political will? As I said earlier, I feel we need a paradigm shift. I don't think we really have the right paradigm to analyze all of this. It's not strictly in Canada. Look at what's happening throughout the world. Investments, people think you invest in green energy, that'll solve everything. In the current financial architecture, there is no substitution effect. It is quite compromised. Thank you very much. That's all the time you have.
Madame Collins.
Madam Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question is to Mr. Kaufman. You, in your initial comments, talked about the peril of labeling climate action as woke. And I just was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about that. We've seen conservative politicians label climate action as woke. And what risks to the Canadian economy, to the Canadian financial system do we face if we engage in that kind of culture war?
Sure. I mean, I think the first point was to say that it was very much that the risks of climate change are financial as well as physical. And as I outlined, there are the transition risks that impact, for example, the oil and gas sector, particularly in Canada. So as global demand falls for oil and gas, particularly for transport fuels, that creates a big problem to that. So by ignoring that transition risk, you are ultimately ignoring the financial headwinds facing that industry and the potential to significantly overinvest into new projects and new production that ultimately fail to deliver a financial return to investors and the stakeholders, and continue through the use of those fossil fuels continue to take the world beyond climate limits and thus pose a cost through the externality associated with the carbon emissions. And so, sorry, by failing to take account of that, it ultimately is failing to take account of the financial risks, and ultimately is bad for all. And it crucially, it's failing to recognise the systemic nature of climate change and the fact that it will impact all sectors.
Thank you, Mr. Cram, for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Professor Deitch, a few minutes ago you said that we need to actively turn off the taps of oil and gas financing. Would it be correct in saying that that is the whole goal and that is the whole purpose of the taxonomy system of the central bank?
So this is an important point. There's two ways that central banks think about climate, right? So one is, to what extent does climate impact finance? And the other is, to what extent does finance impact climate? Central banks across the world have come a long way in thinking about how climate impacts finance, right? They are encouraging commercial banks to look at their exposure to risks and so on. So basically, when climate considerations undermine price stability or financial stability, the central banks are on it. In the other direction, it's not the case, right? So what the financial sector does, and this is what I laid out earlier, when the financial sector acts in a way that slows down climate mitigation, central banks are not very proactive about that part of the equation. And I think that's an important part of the equation.
Yes or a no?
Sorry, I did not hear the follow-up.
So was that a yes or a no? Like, why does the central bank have to do the taxonomy if not to cut off the financing to oil and gas companies?
Well, it is acting to the extent that it poses a risk to price stability and financial stability, but not further than that. So it would be a yes and no. There's no binary answer to that.
Okay, let me move on to Mr. Coffin. Mr. Coffin, you spoke quite negatively earlier about carbon capture and storage. If you have, say, a public utility that has a coal-burning power plant, and the public utility wants to put a carbon capture and storage system onto the coal plant so the CO2 doesn't go off into the atmosphere, it goes under the ground. Why would that be a bad thing? Why would that be something that you would not support?
I think there's a number of reasons. One, carbon capture and storage has been around for a while, but has not been proven to be commercially viable at scale. And actually, this total sum of CO2 captured and fully sequestered on geological timeframes is very limited. The second part is, what is the cost of doing that? And would it actually be cheaper to substitute that coal power generation with renewables, whether that's wind, whether that's solar, whether that's other form of generation? And particularly if that is then that CCS is being subsidized through state or public funds, actually either economic diversification or helping support the transition towards a greener system, that money would be better spelt rather than just on CCS.
Mr. Ali, for 3 minutes. Mr. Ali?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for appearing before the committee. My question is to Mr. Arnold. What measures should be taken to prevent greenwashing in the financial sector?
Yeah, that's a very, very big question, but I think the three main initiatives that I laid out in my opening would cover that well, from taxonomy to climate-related disclosures and transition plans. The combination of those essentially helps shine a light on the physical and transition risks or to the financial system, and doing all of those things and leveling up Canada to where these standards are going internationally is essential to reducing greenwashing and just that misinformation in capital markets.
Great, thanks. And could a green and transition finance taxonomy provide clarity and consistency for investors so they can easily compare the environmental performance and impact of institutions and investment funds to inform their financial decisions?
Absolutely, and you don't have to ask me that question. It was the 25 biggest financial institutions in Canada that are asking for this for exactly that reason. A lot of financial institutions, both in Canada and in other parts of the world, have their own internal taxonomies that they use, but they're all different, and that leads to this alphabet soup of how we track environmental and social and governance issues, or ESG. And so taxonomies are really a way of standardizing that language to reduce greenwashing in capital markets.
Thank you. In the absence of a finalized green and transition taxonomy, how have Canadian financial institutions been assuring potential investors that green financial products are what they appear to be?
I'd say that's difficult. I mean, there are some financial institutions that are a little bit further advanced than others in terms of developing their own internal frameworks and publishing those in a public-facing way. But it is challenging, and especially when we speak to these financial institutions, it requires so much due diligence on their part and a lot of technical knowledge to do this work themselves. Having a standardized national taxonomy is a way of simplifying all of that. If you think of the Energy Star label, for example, if you were to go out and buy a new refrigerator, you as a consumer don't have the time to look into the environmental credentials of that one particular refrigerator.
Merci beaucoup.
So that Energy Star label plays a big role in that.
On doit s'arrêter là-dessus. J'aimerais.
Thank you very much. We'll have to stop here. I'd like to thank the witnesses for sharing their knowledge. It's led to a very interesting discussion, I must say. We'll take a short break to be able to connect to the witnesses for the next panel. So thank you again to the witnesses. I wish you all a good day.
Thanks.
who's appearing as an individual. He is a global macro strategist. We have from Environmental Defense Canada in person with us the Senior Manager Climate Finance, Ms. Julie Siegel, and from Regeneration, we have the Co-Executive Director, Gareth Gransall, who is also by video conference, as is Mr. Diaz. You have 5 minutes for opening statements. We'll start with Mr. Diaz.
Hi there. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. As a proud Quebecer and Canadian, I'm honored to speak with you today, and I want to express my gratitude to the committee members for the opportunity to provide testimony. A little bit about myself. I'm a graduate in McGill in Finance and Economics, CFA charter holder with over 18 years of experience as a global macro strategist. In this capacity, I've worked for large institutional asset managers and hedge funds in the City of London, United Kingdom, and now back in Canada as a portfolio manager, helping families preserve and grow their wealth. I'm one of the co-hosts of Loonie Hour, Canada's most popular economic and financial market podcast that's committed to demystifying capital markets for Canadians. I love what I do, and I'm committed to a dispassionate analysis of macroeconomic phenomena. I've earned the reputation of someone who can articulate cogent and prescient analysis without fear or favor. In my role as global macro strategist, I've researched more topics than I can remember: productivity, housing, monetary policy, energy, etc. And having worked for a large financial institution, I've also been exposed to green finance, ESG, and other sustainable investment initiatives, as well as the corporate apparatus that has mushroomed to exploit society's concerns over the environment. Having reviewed some of the witness testimony in preparation for today, I want to highlight that several speakers are engaged by firms that would directly stand to benefit financially from these types of regulations and are likely to result from the study in question. As loyal employees, it is their responsibility to tell this committee that green finance, sustainable investing, and regulation proposed will benefit Canada and the environment writ large. But their firms' revenues are not tied to lowering global emissions or hitting Canada's Paris agreements, but rather to the billable hours or extra fees they can amass to help navigate the increasing regulatory burden that these necessarily would result. I bring this up to cast spotlight on something that is a critical pillar in the investment world, and that is a fiduciary duty, the obligation to act in the best interest of clients or employers. Put simply, who do you ultimately work for? Investment managers, for example, have the solemn duty to maximize financial returns for our investors or pensioners. It is not to use their position of incredible power to prioritize one social or environmental goal over another, no matter how noble that goal is. To use regulations to coerce financial institutions to subordinate their clients' interests in favor of political goal is, on the face of it, unethical, as it would be for a bank manager to direct its considerable financial power to achieve a political aim rather than to act as a sober custodian for its shareholders. Furthermore, it is not even clear that this would work, resulting in both an unethical action and the net loss of returns to its clients and profits to its shareholders. And there are plenty of examples. The consultants, however, will get very rich. In effect, this is legislation through the back door, and given the reporting of this nature is onerous, the negative impact on a country suffering, and I quote the Bank of Canada here, a productivity emergency, is clearly ill-advised. Another angle for your consideration is the law of unintended consequences. To this, I submit the following testimony. Green energy policy, as it is constituted, is the greatest thing to happen to fossil fuel companies since the transatlantic flight. I repeat, green energy policy has been a gift for the industry you are trying to neuter. Humans consume 101 million barrels of oil a day. This number is rising. It is not falling. Even in a world of hyper EV adoption, it is likely to stay well above 100 million barrels for at least a generation or two. The issue with this is that recent green energy policy has been focusing on starving public oil companies of capital to constrain or constrict the supply of oil, but is doing nothing for demand. This has predictably lifted the floor on oil prices. As a result, normally spendthrift oil companies are now reluctant to deploy capital to procure fresh reserves. Cash flows, on the other hand, are at record levels. because, to repeat, demand is rising and prices are high. This has lifted cash flows along with falling CapEx. There has been an explosion of free cash flows or free cash flow yields. Profits are at a record level, and cash is being returned to shareholders via dividends, share buybacks, and these companies are paying down debt. Green energy policy has instilled a fiscal discipline in the CEOs of these oil companies that shareholders have been begging for 40 years. The industry has never been healthier.
Okay, Mr.
Surely,
Diaz, we're going to have to stop there, but I'm sure we're going to have a lively debate today. So there'll be opportunities to deliver the rest of your ideas, of course. Ms. Siegel, for 5 minutes, please.
Good morning. My name is Julie Siegel. Thank you for inviting me to appear. I lead a program on climate finance policy at Environmental Defense, and I managed a portfolio of investments before working on policy, and I'm a member of the Quebec government's advisory committee for their roadmap to a sustainable financial system. This study about the environmental and climate impacts from Canada's financial institutions is important. Canada needs policy to align our financial system with climate action, and Canadians want it. I'm glad to detail solutions today. Globally, Canada is still recognized as a low-regulation jurisdiction on sustainable finance. The lack of climate-aligned finance policy in Canada harms our environment and people living across the country. The lack of climate-aligned financial policy also damages our competitiveness and for business and investment, but for the benefit of this Environment Committee, I'll focus on the environmental impacts. To start, Canadian financial institutions provide among the largest sums of money to oil, gas, and coal. The harms from oil, gas, and coal are irrefutable when it comes to climate change, with fossil fuels being the leading cause, and are likewise obvious for other environmental harms like water pollution. Where our banks and pension managers place money today determines these real-world impacts. Their climate ambitions do not match the urgency required to limit global warming, and they're not investing sustainably enough. Nearly all of Canada's financial institutions have committed to reduce their climate-harming emissions, but very few have plans or have started to act. Data shows that financial institutions' targets and plans improve when they're regulated to deliver on them. People across Canada understand this, and this is a very important point I'd like to underline. In recent polling, people across Canada said they do not trust their finance institution to take meaningful action on climate change without regulation. Over 90% of people do not trust voluntary action from their financial institution. The majority of people surveyed want rules to ensure the financial system invests more sustainably, and when this is framed as directly countering greenwashing, just about 80% of people want the government to implement sustainability rules for the financial sector. We have ready-made policies in Canada that can be executed. The Climate Aligned Finance Act, introduced by Senator Rosa Galvez, is currently being studied in the Senate. I had the pleasure of being an advisor for this bill. It outlines a set of policies that would align our financial system with Canada's climate commitments of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. More broadly, requiring plans from financial institutions, known as climate transition plans. This is something nearly all previous participants mentioned today. Climate transition plans are key. This ensures that banks, pension plans, insurers, large companies detail plans for climate action, including short-term actions. Modernizing the mandates of financial regulators is another key point to ensure accountability, as is clarifying that leaders of financial institutions should aim to help mitigate climate damages. Public opinion supports these policies. Over 120 groups have specifically endorsed the Climate Aligned Finance Act. Elected officials from 4 political parties, including members from this committee, endorsed a motion to align our financial system with safe climate action. People understand that climate change is expensive. People understand that financial institutions should serve their interests, people as the clients of banks, the beneficiaries of pension funds, and that right now the financial sector is under-regulated on climate and environmental impacts. Canadians are waiting for outcomes on climate-related financial policy. This is the missing piece of Canadian climate policy. In your committee report, I very much encourage you to urge the federal government to prioritize using all tools at its disposal to align Canada's financial system with the Paris Agreement. Canadians want mandatory policy that ensures finance is sustainable and resilient to climate change. Thank you very much for inviting me to testify today, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Ms. Siegel. We'll go now to Mr. Gransall for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for your time. It is an honor to speak to you today. My name is Gareth Gransall, and I'm a researcher at the Institute for Integrated Energy Systems at the University of Victoria. I'm also presenting as the co-executive director of Regeneration, a nonpartisan coalition of business and economic students at 23 campuses across the country. I want to begin my remarks by observing that the people around the world most concerned about climate change are not actually environmentalists, but military experts. The Pentagon calls climate change an existential threat and is preparing for a world of heightened national security risks due to conflict, displacement, and natural disasters. But when you look at the climate stress tests of major financial institutions in Canada, in the fine print, you'll notice something strange, which is that many of them say that climate change is not a material risk to their asset values. How is this possible? Well, Nobel Prize-winning economists Joseph Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern have publicly said that the mainstream models that we use to quantify climate risk, which central banks and prudential supervisors then use to create the guidelines they give to financial institutions, are deeply flawed. And as a result, the data on which the so-called risk experts rely is often very wrong. So let's give an example. We know the world is warming faster than predicted, which means more days of extreme heat. At temperatures higher than 35 degrees, photosynthesis begins to shut down. Therefore, scientists predict that by 2030, the frequency of crop failures in the world's bread baskets could increase by 450%. But the most prominent model that purports to account for the impacts of climate change on the economy, the DICE model, as Mr. Coffin mentioned earlier, literally assumes that systemic failure of global food production wouldn't matter that much because agriculture is only 3% of GDP. Let that sink in for a second. In other words, we're living in a reality gap. There's the real world where 26 million people were displaced by natural disasters last year alone. And then there's the alternate reality that the banks and regulators are living in, where 3 or 4 degrees of warming apparently won't affect asset prices. And that is actually what the CFA Institute is currently teaching their certificate students. Conversely, if you look at the recent report by the UK Institute and Society of Actuaries, you would see that they predict a possible destruction of global GDP by as much as 50% by 2070. The world is currently on track for 3 degrees of warming, and at 1 degree, the town of Jasper, Alberta, burnt to a crisp overnight. And because the climate system behaves in nonlinear ways, 3 degrees is not 3 times worse than 1 degree, it's exponentially worse. There are 9 globally significant tipping points that could all cascade simultaneously, and the Institute for Economics and Peace predicts that at current rates, there could be 1.2 billion climate migrants by 2050. This is why the 1.5 degree temperature threshold is so important. And the good news is that the International Energy Agency has developed a net zero pathway, which would allow us to preserve a livable climate without relying on unrealistic levels of reverse combustion. This is coming from the world's top energy economists, but they're very clear about what this means. No new fossil fuel projects after 2021. The largest 5 Canadian banks are not aligned with this science-based pathway. They have given over $1 trillion to the fossil fuel industry since the signing of the Paris Agreement, including $26 billion to fossil fuel expansion in 2022 alone. Climate change is a systemic risk to the financial system, but it's one that the financial system itself causes by funding fossil fuel expansion. And this self-reinforcing cycle is not going to end without greater policy ambition. Canada's current approach is a choose-your-own adventure that allows financial institutions to disclose risks without actually requiring actions to limit those risks. To address this, we need mandatory 1.5 degree aligned transition plans which align with international best practices, including the UN guidelines for net zero commitments. One way would be to introduce the Climate Aligned Finance Act put forward by Senator Galvez, which would substantially improve corporate governance on this issue. We also need to make sure that new fossil fuel projects are not given a green label under any voluntary or regulated system, and that natural gas stays out of Canada's transition taxonomy. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm now happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gransall. We'll go to the 6-minute round, and it's Mr. Mazier who's batting leadoff, I think.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the witnesses for coming today. Mr. Diaz, my questions will be for you today. Can the Canadian government help meet the targets of the Paris Agreement by interfering in the financial system and by imposing mandatory climate-related disclosures?
Well, I just think it's interesting that the gentleman previous said that we should not expand on natural gas, because the way that the U.S. has absolutely crushed its emissions goals is by shifting from coal to natural gas. And it was done so by financing projects, certainly at the bank level, definitely at pension fund level, and obviously there was some private money in there too. So the idea that, I mean, is the goal to end the fossil fuel industry, or is the goal to end emissions? That's the first thing. The second thing, yes, that would be an important consideration when you think about reducing emissions. The probably most important example of using fossil fuels to drastically, we're not talking about a little bit here, but we're talking about 20% over maybe a 10 or 12 year period, was through a transition to natural gas.
You mentioned the principle of fiduciary duty. Should average Canadians be worried if the government is undermining this principle by trying to achieve a global environmental objective through financial institutions?
I think that having worked for large financial institutions, it's important to understand how and why and when these people get paid. And it is absolutely not to meet global or countrywide green energy goals. There are several examples, for example, of, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to give specific names of ETFs as an example that claim to be, designed to support the climate initiatives or whatever, but really what they do is they exploit people's good intentions or I would say noble view that emissions should be lower or what have you. The consultants that you've heard are the exact same way. If tomorrow someone invented a machine that it immediately fixed climate change at the snap of a finger, those consultants would all be out of business, and I'm sure that they would be reluctant to suggest that as a means to dealing with this obviously very big problem. And so I think it's very, very important that we keep those people's incentives front of mind, and kind of holding that fiduciary duty as a sacred sort of totem for, those investors should be representing the financial interests of those clients first and foremost, above all else, and allowing for legislation if you want to ban oil and gas, bring it to Parliament and let's vote on it. And not going through the back door really is the way I see it, subverting those fiduciary duties that these investors have on their behalf of their clients.
Can you explain how consultants and financial institutions will financially benefit from a climate-related disclosures or ESG ratings at the expense and return for Canadians?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's be honest. The ESG, some of the companies that are supposed to be leaders in this ESG stuff, it's basically just a tick-boxing exercise. And it's really important because through the advent of ETFs, the brokerage fees, the fees that these large asset managers were able to charge have basically been destroyed. You used to be able to, through all kinds of either research dollars or soft dollars, you'd be able to charge hundreds of basis points to your clients on behalf, and in order for the assets that you are managing. ETFs basically allowed individuals to buy pieces of, let's say, the S&P 500 for a de minimis amount of money. It absolutely destroyed that part of the business. And so why the financial markets, financial businesses have been so readily willing to sign up to these sustainable investment stuff, green energy policy, ESG, is because by, if they say, oh, it's expensive to do the due diligence around this business. And so so of course that expensive means that you're adding value. You're doing a job as the financial guy to or girl to see if this business is really meeting their climate objectives. Well, what you end up doing is you end up now you are supposedly adding value, and then you're allowed to charge a lot of money for that value. Therefore, your margins go up because instead of charging 5 basis points on an S&P 500 ETF, you're now allowed to charge 60 basis points for a product that basically does exactly the same with scarcely any reporting. And not to mention that there was, for example, it's not at all clear that they even meet the objective that they even set. So, for example, there's a vegan climate ETF that charges 60 basis points of management expense ratio that basically just tracks the S&P 500, which you can buy for 5 basis points. So, the company's happy, the regulators are happy, the consultants are happy, and the only person who seems to lose out is the individual who genuinely cares about either being vegan or about the climate or what have you.
Do you think the end goal of the concept we are studying today is an attempt to starve capital from Canadian natural resource companies?
Yes, I do, and I think that's why I put in my opening statement that green energy policy is the greatest gift to the oil industry and their shareholders. You are starving companies of capital that are notorious for badly allocating capital. And that's why, from a CFA perspective, you look at cash flow, free cash flow yields. It is about your cash flow relative to your capital expenditure. And what the entire apparatus is about is constraining the capital expenditure for a
we'll
product.
Have to stop there and go to Mr. Longfield.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I've got some questions based on this discussion that we've been having this morning around the changes that we might consider recommending to the Bank of Canada or to the Bank of Canada Act. I'm going to start with Ms. Siegel. Very interesting to see how Senator Galvez's Bill S-243 is progressing through the Senate. They've passed second reading over a year ago, looking at measures like reporting requirements, enforcement of targets with respect to commitments on the climate, additional capital adequacy requirements for banks, and the appointment of persons with climate expertise on the boards of reporting entities, and establishment of climate alignment as a superseding duty for directors, officers, or administrators of reporting entities. Definitely not a status quo bill. Could you comment on how we could possibly include the climate change taxonomy in the Bank of Canada's mandate to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada, knowing that climate change is a real risk to our economic and financial welfare?
Thank you, MP Longfield. So I'll start off by saying I appreciate the kind of end framing of, taxonomy and Bank of Canada. I think it's very important to look much broader than, the taxonomy is one piece of policies that has gotten quite a bit of discussion, and Bank of Canada is one financial regulator. But I think, when looking at all of the pieces within the package of CAFA, including many that you mentioned, including transition plans, updating the mandates of regulators so that they can, hold accountability and evaluate risk on climate change. That much broader package of policies for coherent progress on climate-aligned finance is what I would encourage the committee to consider. So regulators in Canada, including the main federal financial regulator, OSFI, and the Bank of Canada, have studied the significant risks from moving too slowly on climate transition. They've highlighted billions of dollars are at risk of vanishing, essentially being lost in the financial institution if they move too slowly on climate change, and if policy environment moves too slowly on climate change. In moving forward with climate-related financial policies, like transition plans, like all of those mentioned, the other ones mentioned in CAFA, it's very important to create lines of accountability, right? To ensure effectiveness of policy and regulation, you need oversight on those, just like in any other policy. And that's why modernizing the mandates of financial regulators is such an important piece. I'll highlight other jurisdictions have moved forward with that as a core part of not just their financial strategy, or pardon me, not just their climate strategy, but of their financial strategy as well. The European Union, as part of their Green Deal, introduced a package of climate-related financial policies, including clarifying the roles of regulators to oversee the new climate-related policies they're putting forward.
Right, and I was managing director of a European company. I was their Canadian managing director, and this is back in the 90s when we had to report at that time on our sustainability efforts. We had to show and track our movement of waste and seeing how we were recycling, how we were reducing water. Europe seems to have been at this game a lot longer than us. And by us delaying, we could actually be at a financial risk if they start back-charging us. If, for instance, we remove the price on pollution, they're going to say, well, that's fine, but we are going to put that into a levy, and you will be paying a price on pollution either before or after you're shipping goods. Could you comment on how important it is for us to make sure that our taxonomy is to the global standard, but that our implementation is at the global speed?
From a business perspective, investors want certainty, right? So Canada being recognized as a low regulation jurisdiction on sustainable finance creates a competitive risk. It's not attractive for international investment to have policy waffling or policy being behind where other jurisdictions are. It also
if I could hold on to that thought just half a second, because businesses in Canada are having to conform to the European standards already, and government is not keeping up with the pace of business. And that's a concern to me as a former business person, that government is going too slow, and it would be putting my business at risk because we are going too slow when we're competing on a global market. Any comments on that?
Over 1,300 Canadian companies are already subject to European disclosure regulations on sustainability. This creates unnecessary asymmetry in the market, where it's only the larger companies who are subject to those EU regulations that, in fact, have the benefit of thinking in terms of their business strategy of what global investors are expecting to see. So Canada should be stepping forward to meet that global standard. Similarly, California has policies that will likely affect a number of Canadian companies. And having that asymmetry doesn't make sense.
Thank you.
Canada should move forward.
Thank you very much. Madame
Posé,
à votre tour.
Thank you.
6 minutes, Monsieur le Président.
Do I have 6 minutes? Yes. Mr. Gransaw, your organization is a nonprofit organization managed by young Canadians, and you seek to contribute to the development of the next generation of leaders, and I commend you on this mission because it really is a way of really get them to think of the economy in such a way as to better serve human beings, their well-being, and the environment. Last June, you may know that we heard from the CEOs of the 5 major banks, and Mr. Kruger from oil and gas said that the prosperity of the oil and gas industry is the idea that is at the detriment of the planet is false. To the detriment of the planet is false. When there is no scientific expertise within decision-making bodies in these organizations, when you want to find solutions in these areas and investments, then there are some shortcomings. There's a lack of good information. Given your mission at Regeneration, what do you think of the statement made by the CEO of Suncor, Mr. Kruger?
Thank you so much, Madame Posé, for the question. I believe that the statement by Rich Kruger is an intentionally misleading statement. And to the extent that oil and gas companies are misaligned with the recommendations of the International Energy Agency about science-aligned 1.5-degree pathways in which no fossil fuel developments are to be sanctioned after 2021, then it is very obvious that they are pursuing short-term profit at the expense of the health of the environment. And the interesting thing is that this exact kind of trade-off is something that oil and gas executives are very aware of. Imperial Oil did modeling in the 1990s in documents that have now been made public regarding the economy-wide effects of a national carbon price. And this information is available by reporting by Jeff Dembicki in his recent book, The Petroleum Papers. And the results of the modeling that Imperial Oil did found that while a national carbon price would raise overall national GDP in the long term by stimulating the development of new sectors, they found that it would actually reduce Imperial Oil's profits directly for the business lines which they were currently in business for. And so they then decided to spend the next few decades lobbying against robust climate policy, which is why we're in the situation that we're in now, in addition to the behavior of many other companies in that regard.
I'll stop you right there. Actually, yes, you did do a study on the business economics. They're rewriting business economics, and from what I'm gathering from your answer, it looks like it's all about profit, that the environment is, not a concern. Actually, they're not concerned about the cost of climate change. So more well-educated individuals who know about the environment would be really important to have in these boards. Madam Siegel, the European Union's directive on corporate social responsibility requires that businesses disclose the risks to them for climate change, but also the material impacts they have on the social and environmental factors. How could you qualify the gap in Canada versus what's going on in this European directive? And what effect would the implementation of a rigorous framework have for Canada's commitment in terms of climate change? I'll continue in English.
So the European Union has a perspective that considers both the risks and the impacts of the financial sector when it comes to climate change and sustainability. In Canada, we don't yet have a disclosure premise yet to even just get information to the market, let alone yet considerations of how investments affect the environment and climate change. So to some of the earlier discussions today, I'll highlight that disclosures do not, in fact, affect financial flows one way or the other necessarily. They provide information. They're, in fact, quite benign. What in fact, the European Union does further, and what I encourage considerations for in Canada, is policies that look at the actions and impacts from financial flows in terms of advancing, what you were highlighting, Député Posey, as a concept of, the double materiality of financial flows, that finance does have real impacts on the worsening of climate change or resilience to it.
D'ailleurs, le Canada, je pense,
in fact, it's been 7 or 8 years that Canada's been talking about sustainable finance and taxonomy, but the European Union had an action plan in this area in 2018, ready in 2018, 3 years after Paris. Do you have an idea what it actually means for every year that Canada does not move ahead on this? Thank you very much. Clearly, it's taken too long to advance their policies to align finance and climate.
I'd say that the costs of climate change continue to worsen every year, and the slower that we move on implementing climate-aligned financial policy, the more those costs affect people across the country. $100 billion of just insured damages has been calculated over the past 3 years in Canada, so that is why, I ended my comments by really encouraging not just progress on these policies, but for the government to prioritize implementing that progress.
Ms. Collins.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. I just want to maybe start with Mr. Grensel, and maybe in response to something Mr. Diaz said. In your comments, you noted the importance of keeping LNG out of the taxonomy. And Mr. Diaz had said that's surprising given the U.S. Is using LNG to drive down emissions. Now, in January of this year, the U.S. announced a pause on LNG export permits because their analysis was out of date and doesn't account for the greenhouse gas emissions. Can you just talk a little bit about why it's so important that we do not include fossil fuels and in particular LNG as part of the taxonomy, and particularly why we would not want to label fossil fuels as sustainable?
Thank you, Ms. Collins, for that question. First of all, there are a myriad of reasons why this is necessary. And to the extent that essentially, natural gas, for many reasons, has fugitive methane emissions that are not measured. And so a lot of the claims that have been made that natural gas is the reason why various jurisdictions have actually seen a significant decline in emissions is oftentimes not accounting for the role of this other greenhouse gas, which is actually, in the short term, 81 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. So that's a very important point. Another point that's very important to raise is that at this point, because of the long-term trajectory in the decline of prices in renewable energy in ways that have been entirely unpredicted by economists as a result of rapid learning curves and technology adoption, we now know that renewable energy in a lot of places is cheaper than natural gas at this point, which undermines the long-term investment thesis for new LNG in a way that ultimately means that a lot of the time new LNG exports will actually displace demand for new renewable energy, particularly in Asia. And the other point about the cost curve that's necessary to know is that this also causes the risk of stranded assets for new LNG as an asset class in a way that is likely to cause significant financial effects in the future.
And to Ms. Siegel, can you comment on the dangers of including LNG and fossil fuels as sustainable in the taxonomy?
Thank you, MP Collins. I would highlight the well-put points by colleagues from Carbon Tracker saying that transitioning away from fossil fuels is essential to keep warming to safer levels. And so decarbonizing the process of that, in fact, creates an opportunity cost. As I said, I used to work in finance, and the concept of opportunity cost is fundamental, as is sunk cost of throwing bad money after bad, which we should not be doing with this taxonomy. I'll underline, again, this global perspective and agreement of transitioning away from fossil fuels. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which includes just about 200 countries, agreed that we need to transition away from fossil fuels and increase renewable energy and energy efficiency. Just 2 days ago, the UN Summit for the Future reiterated those points about transitioning away from fossil fuels, scaling up renewable energy, and increasing energy efficiency. So that trajectory is quite clear globally, and Canada would be entirely remiss to move in a different direction. That's from a climate perspective. From an investment perspective, the credibility of the taxonomy would be incredibly hampered, to put it lightly, if it were to include fossil fuels. So for both business and environmental reasons, artificially labeling fossil fuels, oil, gas, or coal as sustainable does not make sense.
And we've heard from climate experts and environmental advocates that no taxonomy would be better than a taxonomy that includes fossil fuels as sustainable. Is that your opinion?
A taxonomy that green lights activities that are considered greenwashing would be worse for it would muddy the waters rather than clarify them, absolutely.
Thank you. You talked a bit about transition plans. Can you tell the committee how other countries are legally requiring transition plans and the importance of ensuring that Canada doesn't continue to fall behind these other jurisdictions?
Principal allies of Canada that have been moving forward with transition plan regulation include the United Kingdom, Australia, and the European Union. They have regulated this in the EU through what's known as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, in the UK through a landmark initiative called the Transition Plan Task Force, and in Australia through a comprehensive sustainable finance roadmap. All of these have started with very traditional financial regulation policies by requiring transition plans in disclosure. The new government in the United Kingdom has committed to requiring alignment with 1.5 degrees from those transition plans. So saying not only do you have to have one, but you need to have a credible one for climate action. And that is recognized as the gold standard, the benchmark of transition planning globally. standard setters globally, the ISSB, as it's known, has picked up that UK progress for transition plans, and it's only proliferating globally. So it is happening through traditional financial policy mechanisms and being continuously strengthened globally, even though Canada has not yet started and certainly should.
Okay, we'll go to the second round. We'll same thing as last time. It'll be a 3-minute round. Mr. Leslie.
Mr. I'd like to start with you, and I appreciate the heavy dose of reality regarding how financial markets and companies work in this space. Do you believe that companies that do take a priority focus on ESG initiatives, shifting away from stakeholders, is problematic, and what those impacts in real terms actually are?
I mean, I just think what will happen is that all of these Western countries that ostensibly care about the environment will be left in the dust economically. It is very clear that the panel understands that fossil fuel consumption is rising, not falling.
So do you think, is this a duty that politicians are better placed with? And you mentioned kind of a backdoor to try to end our natural resource sector. Are we actually just pawning this off on the private sector, the financial sector, to do what is our dirty work if we choose to destroy Canada's natural wealth economy?
Yes, I do. But also what cannot happen will not happen. If it were not for Canada's energy sector, our economy would basically collapse overnight, and our welfare state, as we understand it, would be unsustainable. We would have to have a massive internal devaluation in form of massive consumption cuts of all kinds of consumption, or an external one, which means our currency would decline because of our current account balance and our lack of productivity and our massive debt overhangs.
Yep. We need to understand the country that we are. From a recent article from Mintz and Tingle in 2024, it raised the point that ESG mandates make our public markets less attractive to new entrants. We've heard some differing views on that from other panelists. Do you agree with their statement that these directives are actually a long-term harm to our national economy?
I mean, I think what people just don't understand is how financial markets work, and not to be glib, but what will happen is that these companies will just simply opt out. They will be privately financed, or as I demonstrated earlier, because green energy policy focuses on cutting supply and does nothing about global demand, these companies are minting money. They are making so much money, they do not need bank financing, government financing, and the rest of it. And there's going to be consolidation in that sector, and it won't matter it won't matter how much reporting you have if they don't need your cash. They're just going to do whatever they want, and they'll just move to wherever they need to. Specifically, China, Indonesia, and India, who have all made coal, forget natural gas, coal, essential to their next 100 years of economic development.
So let's bring this back to the reality of the little guy. What is the impact of that money flowing out of our country due to this overabundance of ESG initiatives? What does that mean for the average person and their wealth creation and their pension?
Canada is in a productivity crisis, and that's not my word. That's the words of Deputy Governor of Bank of Canada, Carolyn Rogers. We have massive outflows of money. We have not increased our our gross fixed capital formation, or CapEx, in 12 years in real terms. We do not need more incentive to push capital away. And by the way, it's not foreign capital that's necessarily not coming. It's that domestic capital is leaving. So those pension fund managers that you want to regulate, they just simply say, we'll sign up for all the green initiatives you want, and we're going to go invest in the U.S. and don't forget, I mean, Europe is just a total joke.
We're going to have to go to Mr. Vancouver, please.
Sorry. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Siegel, we've heard a lot of this kind of doomsday scenario from Canadian economists who claim as though, oil sands production and the contributions to the economy are so vital to Canadian identity, to the Canadian economy, yet we know that oil sands are basically the only sector that are still increasing their emissions, and they contribute a large but less than 2% quota to our annual GDP. I don't want to take away from the importance of the energy sector in Canada. They certainly have driven our economy for many, many years, but is it your perspective or opinion that without oil sands production in Canada, our economy would would flatline, stop growing, or we'd hit a giant recession, as been intimated by other witnesses?
Thank you. I mean, I don't have a personal opinion on this, but my understanding of the research is that the oil sands provide an increasingly small economic contribution to Canada. The oil and gas sector has been shedding job opportunities voluntarily for many years, actually, before climate policy even really began at the federal or provincial level. They have been shedding workers and communities who devoted their lives to the industry in efforts to perhaps consolidate operations, or in essence, it has been making an increasingly small contribution to the real benefit of Canada's economy, workforce, et cetera. The emissions from the oil and gas sector are obviously quite harmful. The environmental impacts from the oil and gas sector is obviously quite harmful if we consider the toxic wastewater leaks that have happened from large oil and gas companies earlier, or that were revealed earlier this year. So, I mean, I would highlight all of those points and reiterate what I shared before about this sunk cost fallacy, right? Yes, that has been the economy, as part of the economy of Canada for many years, but in fact, all of our competitors, many of whom other witnesses mentioned, including Asian economies, are actually moving much faster towards the climate transition. China is the fastest installer of renewable solar energy. They are the fastest innovator in green technologies, to the extent that Canada is already falling behind, and I very much encourage policies to ensure that we create job opportunities, economic opportunities in the obvious contemporary green economy rather than the anachronistic one that no longer serves us.
Okay, thank you. We're up. The time's up, yeah. Madame Posey.
1 minute. Alors ça... 1 minute, okay. That'll be quick. I hear Mr. Diaz talk about the economy, the capital, but all of these other financial terms, but we're not hearing about health. I know that climate change has an effect on health, and that's also expensive. My figures date, but I think it's about 6% of GDP on healthcare. Would you have anything to say to Mr. Diaz, or what would you respond? Is there anything else you'd like to add in another sort of vein?
Activité basée? Parfait.
Oui. Yes.
I would say one thing that people don't quite understand is that the financial system is deliberately opaque and often made out to be much more complex than it is. Financial policy is an opportunity, in fact, for government to take accountability for an important sector that is having an impact on the world that we're living in and on the effects of climate change. So by not regulating the financial sector, it's missing a very important piece of Canadian climate policy, which needs to be made consistent with other pieces. I'd also highlight, again, the very significant cost of inaction here. This is relevant to people living across the country. This is relevant to businesses and investors. If we think about in 2021, the drought in the prairies cost and harmed farmers living there.
Thank you.
The BC Atmospheric River caused significant devastation and supply chain damages across the country. So those really show the need for economic policy.
Ms. Collins, please.
And maybe I'll give you the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more just on how failing in this respect and how falling behind our peers not only impacts international competitiveness, but impacts Canadians.
Thank you very much, and apologies for that. So I'd say in addition to the economic impacts, which I've just highlighted, we also have to consider the risks to our economic and financial system overall. Over $100 billion of Canadians' assets are at risk of losing value from investors moving too slowly on the climate transition. Having policy in place to modernize our financial system and our financial regulations creates a natural direction for a financial system to be able to be resilient to the damages from climate change, which affects the people who rely on that, as well as ensure that Canada has a chance of meeting our climate commitments to limit the environmental damages to people across the country.
Do I have 10 seconds? Okay, maybe just to end with a thanks to all of our witnesses. It's wonderful, especially to have someone from the University of Victoria. And thank you to Ms. Siegel from Environmental Defense. We really appreciate your work.
Thank you. Mr. Leslie, 3.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Diaz, it looked like you were ready to jump in at one of my colleagues' opportunities to clarify something, so feel free to jump in with what you're planning to say.
I just think the idea that there are no trade-offs is, to me, one of the major fallacies of this kind of analysis and work. Without, and I think what you're seeing is a perfect example of that in Germany. Germany's economy shut down nuclear power plants and is transitioning to renewable energies, and as a function of that, their industrial production has collapsed, and their unemployment rates are rising. Their economy was centered on turning cheap energy into products that we all wanted. And the Madame outlined that you don't care about people. And I would tell you, as a person who grew up in a working class neighborhood, working class parents, employment and your economy growing is the single best way that you can improve the lot and lives of underprivileged people who don't have fancy degrees, and certainly not consultants. And so I think that this idea that there are no trade-offs to constraining and basically shuttering the single most important importer of hard currency to our economy in the form of fossil fuels is to me very naive, and I would argue disassociated from the fact.
Maybe just to expand on that, and hopefully rather briefly, is there a scenario where this intensive focus on ESG would not actually slow down growth, that this actually can induce real growth in our economy, or is it going to be more likely the latter outcome which you just alluded to?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the reality, yes, I think that it's the prisoner's dilemma. I think that if every single country in the world, including China, Indonesia, and India, who are expanding their coal, and the lady mentioned that they were increasing renewables, I would just submit to you to please look up the actual numbers of new coal fire power plants that they built in 2023, 102 gigawatts. That's more than the entire world's coal expansion in one country. If every single country were to all do this at the exact same time, then maybe I would argue it would have some benign impact. But we know that that's not happening, and so then as a function of that, capital will simply flow to the countries that don't care about the environment.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to cede the rest of my time to Mr. Mazur.
Mr. Chair,
I'd like to speak to that. Thanks.
Present the following notice of motion. So this is just a notice. Given that between June 1st, 2024 and September 12th, 2024, Justin Trudeau, A, logged over 92,000 kilometers of jet travel across 58 different trips, B, was in the air at least once every 2 days on average, C, traveled enough this summer to circle the globe twice over.
Just questioning the relevance to today's meeting with respect to Mr. Mazur's motion. Are we discussing the Prime Minister at all today?
Yeah, he's not moving a motion. He's giving a notice.
We're in a meeting.
I have a question though for the clerk. Does this? I mean, this is within the 3 minutes. At 3 minutes, do we stop, or does Mr. Mazur get to continue to speak to give a notice of motion? Or yeah, I think to be honest, since we're not debating the motion, I mean, you could.
So I had a minute left.
Well, you don't have a minute. No, it was like we had about 30 seconds left. So
you won't let me give a notice of motion.
Give the
it's
notice
not that
of
long.
motion.
It's only 5 points.
Well, but that's eating up a lot of time. So
30 seconds.
Mr. Chair, I just like to question why we're doing this at the end of the meeting when notice of motion can be done electronically.
Yeah.
Whether if it's just for a clip, that's fine. There are
I
free video
I agree.
cameras here, which is
Chair,
very
the
handy.
motion was very clear why we were doing it.
Why you're?
So the motion, if you let me finish the motion, it was
Well, no.
very
The problem is, Mr. Mazur, This is not to debate a motion which would open up unlimited time for debate. This is to present a notice of motion, which you can do electronically instead of eating into the committee's time. So I would...
Point of order.
I would say, I think you made some points that you wanted to make, but I'd like to go on to Ms. Taylor-Roy now, and you can send the...
You had a point of order.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Just, if Mr. Mazer has 30 seconds in his time, is he not allowed to use that time how he wishes and continue?
Well, he's already used it. I mean...
I don't know if he used it since we started the point of order. We wasted more time having this conversation.
When he started speaking, there was 20 seconds left in Mr. Leslie's time, and I think we're well over the 20 seconds. So I think, you made your point, Mr. Mazer. I mean, you made your point in the time that I did allow you, but I think, yes, now we're going to have to go on to Ms. Taylor-Roy and wrap this up. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
I don't even know if it was a point of order. Is that a point of order when Ms. Collins raised? Was that point of order that Ms. Collins raised? I guess it was because it was about the rules, I suppose, in a way. But do you have a point of order, Mr. Leslie?
I was going to continue on hers, but I will raise one. Just ask the clerk if we could look if there's precedent, so we know for next time whether or not the member should be allowed to finish his statements once he begins it.
But when he's not moving a motion. Yeah, okay, let's find out. When you're not moving a motion, can you speak forever? That's the question. So okay, we're going to go now to Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you again to the witnesses. There are so many questions I could ask, but I'd actually like to turn to Gareth Granso, because I'm interested in regeneration and representing 23 different groups of young people or youth. I've been listening to the conversation today. And what would you say? What would the response of young people across Canada be to some of the arguments that have been put forward today as to why we should not regulate oil and gas companies or financial institutions when it comes to climate change?
Well, I would say that there's numerous responses that I would have. One is that the idea that everything that we are asking for is a violation of fiduciary duty is false. There are many, many legal experts across the country that have issued opinions that the responsibility of corporate directors to understand and mitigate climate risk is a necessary part of fiduciary duty in Canada. I would also add that in Canada, fiduciary duty is defined as a duty of care to the interests of the corporation, which can include a large variety of concerns, including long-term concerns. And there's also, we must understand that there are companies that have actually already failed as a result of climate change. Pacific Gas and Electric in California was a $30 billion bankruptcy that their corporate directors sort of were not able to foresee as a result of climate change, that now the company doesn't exist. In terms of the fiscal discipline,
Can I just intervene, because I had one other thing to ask about, which is, we've been told many times that our problem is that we do not understand capital markets, and that's why we're going down this route. I just want to say, as someone who helped raise over $500 million on Wall Street for a company in the energy sector, that some of us who understand capital markets may also still find that what you're saying is not correct. And the kind of condescending tone that's been given regarding our understanding or lack of understanding of capital markets, I find offensive. And I just want to ask you, Mr. or Gareth, do you feel like the problem here is that people don't understand what's going on? Or do you believe that perhaps people have a different opinion as to what the fiduciary responsibility of these companies should be?
I believe that there are a lot of considerations that are involved, and one of them is that there are unfortunately sometimes trade-offs between the very short-term interests of companies and the long-term interests of companies. And in the way that capitalism has evolved over the last 50 years, there has been an increasing trend towards defining fiduciary duty in very short-term ways, particularly as the compensation of corporate directors has been increasingly linked to stock price, which has not always historically been the case. And as a result, events like the bankruptcy that I gave are more likely to be the case in the future, to the extent that corporate directors are incapable of acting on longer term time horizons, including the horizons over which climate change materializes.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. I think we'll stop there. I want to thank the witnesses for an excellent discussion, a lively discussion. It's helpful to address these issues and gain a better understanding of them. So we'll take a 2-minute break because now we have to go in.
Yes,
And I guess I want to circle back to my motion. The fact is that it is my right.
Point of order, Mr.
We're
Chair.
going to find out.
I don't think that's the point of order.
Find out before this meeting closes because we're going in camera, right? It is my right to give verbal notice during a meeting. And when I gave the notice, committee was all sitting here, it was my time.
Okay, well,
So-
I don't have an answer for you just this moment, but we'll...
But before we go into in camera, I would like a decision.
My decision was that your time was up, and
So
that
it's not my
you weren't
right-
moving.
it's
You
not
weren't
my
moving.
right to give
You
verbal
weren't
notice.
moving a motion. You weren't moving a motion.
up.
You were
Sounds like your government.
you were giving notice, and I don't. I mean, we'll see what if the committee disagrees with my decision, we can. Are we challenging the chair?
Sure.
Okay, so let's have a vote on that.
That I cannot give verbal notice on
Well,
my
in the
motion.
time that you,
Once I started.
as I understand
Once
it,
I
it's in the. If I'm wrong, I will gladly apologize to you,
There you go.
Mr.
You read my
Mazier. But I
motion.
don't know if I'm wrong yet, so
You're
we'll
gonna
find out.
read my
But in the
motion.
meantime, if you'd like to challenge the chair's decision, please do so, and we'll have a vote. If not, I'm going to adjourn so we can go in camera.
Okay.
Are you challenging the chair?
Yes.
Okay, let's have a vote. There's no real debate on this. Is it a point of clarification?
My point of clarification was, is there any debate on this?
No.
Okay, and so if we vote yes, we support the chair, and if we vote no,
I get to read my motion.
okay.
Okay,
Well,
so
according to you.
Do you agree with Mr.
It's a pretty
Mazier that
important
the
issue.
chair was wrong? Do you agree with Mr. Mazier that the chair was wrong?
I feel like we're
guess
going to
that's-
find out later what the verdict
Yeah.
is. So
Yeah. So a yes is with Mr. Mazier, a no is. Okay, whatever. Yeah. Okay. A yes is with the chair. You're sustaining the chair. A no is you're with Mr. Mazier.
Mr. Ali,
Yes.
Madame Chatel, Mr. Longfield, Ms. Taylor-Roy,
Yes.
Mr. Vancouverton,
Yes.
Monsieur Datel,
No.
Mr. Krim,
No.
Mr. Leslie, Mr. Mazer,
No.
Madame Posey,
Oui.
Ms. Collins.
yes.
Okay, so we're going to adjourn for a couple of minutes so we can do all we have to do to go in camera. Thank you.
you.